like right now.
Yeah, like do we have to do now?
No, we don't have to do it now, even though it is the winter of our discontent. May Glorious Summer by Dr. Sandy Mitcham joining us for week 2 and the exciting conclusion for his top 10, I guess bottom 10 list. But before we get started, the views and opinions expressed in this broadcast are not necessarily those of the SCV, its GDC, nor any division brigades, camps, or other subsidiaries, strictly those of us expressing them. And good evening to everybody in the chat, and Faversham as well. Hope everybody has had a great week. And look at Kyle Thompson from the Kentucky Division showing up on time.
Well, I mean, we were a couple seconds late, so
or he's a couple of days late for Thursday's episode where we covered a lot of news from the Kentucky Division.
Yeah, I don't think I saw you there, Commander.
He wasn't. But happy to be back and happy to have Dr. Mitcham back with us for the exciting conclusion. If you missed last week's episode, go and give it a rewatch. We covered Dr. Mitcham's top 10 best and as well as the honorable mentions, and we will bring them up really quickly again. Number 1 being Nathan Bedford Forrest, number 2 being Robert E. Lee, number 3 being Stonewall Jackson, and as Dr. Mitcham mentioned, they're interchangeable. Depending on the day of the week, they're the top 3. Wade Hampton on his number 4, Richard Taylor number 5, Josiah Gorgas number 6, PTG Gus Beauregard number 7, Pat Claiborne at number 8, Edward Porter Alexander at number 9, William Barksdale as number 10, and Johnston Pettigrew tied in 10th place as well. His honorable mentions were Jubal Early, Dabney Maury, Arnold Elzey, John Brown Gordon, who I would have put in my top 10, but I'm glad to see he's in the honorable mention. Joseph R. Anderson, John Walker, and Edward Walthall, another Mississippian. We covered the first half of his worst list, which included Lucius Northrop, Daniel M. Frost, John B. Floyd, George Crittenton, Albert Rust, and we ended on Theophilus H. Holmes. And then that brings us into number 7, Henry Sibley. So who is Henry Sibley?
Yeah, I'd like to make a diversion, if you don't mind.
Divert away.
Yeah, a digression, if you will. Ron Kennedy asked me to mention Raphael Sims, who was a naval officer. If you rate the top 10 officers of the Confederacy, you certainly have to consider him. I didn't because he wasn't a general but for 3 weeks. But he certainly was an outstanding officer and played havoc with the Union commerce. He, on the Alabama, they took out 65 Union ships. They sank a Union warship. And before that, on the Sumter, which was not a stable vessel, he took out 18 more. So you got to put him as one of the top officers in the Confederacy, although he was, like I say, not a general till April of 1865, on April 5th, after he scuttled his James River squadron. Jefferson Davis appointed him general. He surrendered exactly 3 weeks later and didn't fight any major battles as an infantry officer. But he certainly was a great naval officer. In fact, he also was a great lawyer because he saw to it that they paroled him both as an admiral and as a general. And because he had sunk so many Union vessels, a lot of the Yankee shipping interests and insurance companies wanted to hang him.
Yeah, that's a pirate.
Yeah, and they put him in jail for 4 months, but they couldn't figure out how they could convict him without violating their own terms of the parole, so they let him go. And he became a judge in Alabama. He was well beloved. The city of Mobile gave him a house. Ironically, he died from eating a bad oyster. But certainly, if you list the top 10 officers of the Confederacy, I think he'd be in there.
And I agree. I actually had him on my list, just because it is an interesting, little tidbit about him being a general at the end of the war. Especially because the Naval Brigade, there at Sailors Creek, and then those that were broken off and made it to the AOT surrender, is such a undertold part of our history.
Yeah, and of course Sims wasn't at Sailor Creek, but a good part of his brigade was, and that was where it was destroyed on April 6, 1865. It would have been interesting if it had been involved in Bentonville or some of those later battles, to see how it would have done.
Yeah, well, that's one thing. McClooney used to have a Confederate Marine Corps reenacting group, and I've we've reformed our battalion, so we really don't do anything with the Marine unit anymore. We still have our uniforms, but the fact that there was a Marine detachment, it's what held the longest at Sailors Creek after pretty much fought what could be considered a rearguard action is just something that's really undertold.
Yeah, there was only one U.S. Marine who made general officer in the Confederacy. His name was Kirkman, and it's rather interesting that Joe Johnston was commanding the Army of Tennessee at that point, and he was informed that the Yankees were about to launch an attack on Kirkman's brigade, and he said, "Good. I'd rather them attack Kirkman's brigade than any brigade in our army." And I think that said something positive about him and the Marine Corps training he underwent. Oddly, he got kicked out of West Point. That's why they gave him a commission in the Marines.
Well, some things work out. Some things just work out.
Yeah, it did. Worked out well. I'm sorry, but I diverted, and go back to your original script if you want to.
Well, not really script, as much as of course, I knew the names on the top 10 and the honorable mentions, but it's the worst that are really sticking out. And Henry Sibley, who in the world was Henry Sibley?
Henry Sibley was a former regular Army officer, and he performed extremely well. Mexico and in the West, he invented a stove that was used for many years, and the Sibley tent, a modified form of it, was used as late as World War II. The problem with him was alcohol. It ruined him. One man said his love for alcohol exceeded his love for Army, the country, or God. His men called him the walking whiskey keg. At the Confederate victory at Val Verde, where he was theoretical commander, he was so drunk he could barely stay on his horse. He spent days in his tent, drunk or hungover. And the victories won in New Mexico were won by his subordinates, most notably Tom Green and Dirty Neck Bill Scurry, both of whom made general officer. But Sibley was a failure, and Jefferson Davis gave him another chance because Davis had been Secretary of War and remembered him from those days before he became an alcoholic or notable alcoholic. And he put him under Richard Taylor's command. If you know anything about Taylor, you know how that ended. He showed up drunk. Taylor arrested him, and there was convention in both armies that volunteer officers did not file charges against West Pointers. Richard Taylor never heard of it. He had him arrested and court-martialed for cowardice. And the court martial was kind of stacked in Sibley's favor because they didn't want to disgrace him, but his career was ruined. They sent him back and gave him a couple of minor appointments, like direct a wagon train. Well, it's really hard to screw that up if the enemy doesn't attack your wagon train. And usually that job's handled by a lieutenant, maybe a captain, not a general. So Sibley got a job after the war with the ruler of Egypt. And, Muslim country, they're not supposed to have alcohol, but he got hold of enough to get himself sacked for excessive indebtedness and alcoholism. And they sent him home in disgrace. And he lived in Fredericksburg, Virginia with a daughter for the rest of his life, and pursued lawsuits for patent violation. The Army continued to use his tent and his stove, but they didn't pay him for it anymore because he was a Confederate. He lost the lawsuits. And he was stuck with legal fees and died in indebtedness. It's a sad tale for an officer who was once outstanding back in Mexico and fighting the Indians in the antebellum West. But, if you notice that list of worst officers that I'd have, great many of them, the problem was drunkenness.
Yeah.
Alcoholism filled a lot of cemeteries in the Civil War. I think, and Ulysses S. Grant was part of that. He wasn't always as sober as he should have been, and he got taken by surprise. Shiloh, Fort Donelson, and Champion Hill, and to an extent the Wilderness. I don't know how much alcoholism played a part of it, but certainly was a factor. So the bottle hurt both sides.
Yeah, as it tends to do, because sometimes you'll forget your hotel room key when you get in the bottle a little bit too much. Number 8, you have somebody who I would have picked in the top 3, myself, but you have Braxton Bragg. Mr. won't give himself boots himself.
Well, you could make a case for it. His performance was uneven, but mostly bad. Although, frankly, and I'm saying this with the benefit of perfect 20/20 hindsight, if I was president of the Confederacy and knew then what I know now, I would have made Braxton Bragg chief of training for the entire Confederate Army, because he was a great training officer.
Yeah.
The sorry field commander. But I look at the Army of Pensacola down there in 1861 and early 1862. He trained the 1st Florida Infantry Regiment, the 9th and 10th Mississippi Infantry Regiments, the 1st, 7th, 18th, and 19th Alabama. The 5th Georgia came out of there, the 1st Louisiana, and the 7th Arkansas. I'm not sure if the 3rd came out of there or not. I meant to look it up, but I didn't. These are some of the best regiments in the Confederate Army I just mentioned. And they were a product of Braxton Bragg's Army of Pensacola, which was essentially a training command. So he was a fine training officer. And then they sent him up to help Sidney Johnston at Shiloh, where he arrived with what one author said was all the calmness of a hurricane, and performed mediocre at Shiloh. And they gave him the Army because Jefferson Davis couldn't abide Beauregard. And Bragg had helped save the Army along with Davis's 1st Mississippi Infantry Regiment in the Battle of Buena Vista. And I think one of Jefferson Davis's major faults was loyalty to a fault. He stuck by his friends, and he stuck by Bragg longer than he should have. Going back to something you said last time, Connor, you said that Joe Johnston should have been listed as one of the worst. I thought about it and I decided you're probably right, because after the Battle of Stone River and the Army was lost faith in Braxton Bragg, there was a clamor to replace him, and Jefferson Davis thought about it. And he asked Johnston what he thought about it. And Johnston said, absolutely not. He gave Bragg a full vote of confidence. And that may have been because he had confidence in Bragg, but it may have been because he didn't want to fight the battle himself, because he was next in line to command the Army. And I kind of think that's what it was. He had had a taste of that in Virginia, and it didn't work out so well. He retreated and burned our major supply depot without bothering to evacuate it. And the Southern armies were never well supplied after that. And he retreated all the way till 6 miles in front of Richmond before he fought a battle. And that was Seven Pines. And while it wasn't a disaster from our point of view, it certainly was a defeat. But on the other hand, Bragg did move the Army from Tupelo to Kentucky and outflanked a couple of Union armies in the process. So you got to give him credit for that. But on the field, he couldn't do it.
No, and that's another thing that I will say about Joe Johnston and Braxton Bragg is now Bragg was a lot more harsh, disciplined with the troops. Sam Watkins writes about it in Company H. But that they did have respect for the troops, for I guess is the best way to put it. Johnston didn't want to, in my opinion, that's the one saving grace about Joe Johnston, is he didn't want to throw his men into the meat grinder unless he was absolutely certain of victory. But I think Bragg, is the same thing. He didn't want to, go into battle unless he knew it was an absolute victory that was coming up. But still, even though like Chickamauga, he still managed to pretty well bungle it until Longstreet's corps comes up as reinforcements. So it kind of reminds me, both of them, you could best, to me, summarize them with what Joe Hooker said about himself in the wake of Chancellorsville, was, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker. I think Johnston lost a lot of confidence in himself after First Manassas. And then Bragg, I don't think he ever had confidence in himself as far as a battlefield commander. Bragg, my big thing with Bragg is you're always going to have, subordinates fighting against each other. But, when you have your own subordinates being outright mutinous, there in 62 after Stones River, as well as after, several other engagements, something's got to give.
Well, Bragg was, I'll say one thing for him: he was good at finding scapegoats. He could always find somebody else to blame. And if that's your main talent, you got a problem. And
right.
I kind of think it was. On his, and this isn't really complimenting him at all, but part of the problem was his health. He was in bad health much of the time and had frequent and migraine headaches. And, like when he had that famous confrontation with Forrest, he got out of a bed because his head was hurting so badly. And that happened a lot. It made him irascible. And some people's medical condition affects their temper. And it certainly affected his. And he had his supporters like, Patton Anderson supported him. General Idell supported him. I had a few, but I think the South would have done much better had they kept Beauregard as commander in 1862. He conducted a brilliant retreat from Corinth to, from Shiloh to Corinth, and was unmolested at Tupelo, and he went on leave because he had a recurring sore throat. And he told the War Department he was going, but he didn't tell Jefferson Davis, who, when he found out, exploded and fired him. Replacing him with Bragg was a mistake.
Yeah.
Looking back, I'm not sure who they'd replace him with. It would have been a whole lot better. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, and Bragg's strength, like you mentioned, was in training. Actually, it was this past year at Camp Moore. We had a guy who came through and he actually put the troops through some of the drills that Bragg had his men go through, which was how quickly you could, pack a knapsack and, get ready for the march. It was a relay race. How quickly you could fire 3 rounds from prone, kneeling, and standing. And I can't remember the third one that was a part of that relay race, but it was a lot of fun. I could see where the men would appreciate that, and and part of Bragg's, before the war, he was a quartermaster. I mean, he served in Mexico, but for the vast majority of his time, he was a quartermaster. And I just wonder what would have happened if Bragg would have been put in more of an administrative position than actual command.
Certainly, he would have done better. But I don't know. Even at Chickamauga, he kind of messed him up. Chickamauga, in my view, the Confederate Army won the military equivalent of winning the lottery. They traveled 900. Longstreet's Corps traveled 923 miles over some very questionable railroads. Arrived at the station there, and Braxton Bragg hadn't even sent a guide to lead them where to go. Longstreet had to look for one. But when he attacked 15 minutes later after the Union general, Rosecrans, had moved the division to plug an imaginary hole and created a real hole, which Longstreet poured through 15 minutes later. I mean, how lucky can you get?
Right.
It was a great Confederate victory. Bragg had little to do with it. You can say he was a poor field commander. And then he lost his nerve, as he frequently did, and stopped the pursuit. Joe Wheeler, who I don't think highly of, did pursue slightly on the 20th that night, early morning on the 21st, and picked up a couple of thousand demoralized prisoners. I think if they had attacked Chattanooga on the 21st, I think they would have taken the place and captured the entire Union Army. And
I agree.
That would probably have resulted in our independence.
Well, definitely that political victory would have stopped Atlanta from falling. Because agree with you. Agree with you there. Well, number 9, you have one that I'm quite interested because he's has some Mississippi fame. You have W.W. Loring as number 9.
Loring had some talent, but not enough. I
would categorize Loring as mediocre. I mean, with what he did with the Yazoo Pass and Fort Pemberton, as well as being able to get his division out during after the debacle of Champions Hill. I mean, to me those are both pretty decent.
I disagree. Fort Pendleton was a good engineer. I mean, That
No,
was his position.
Pemberton with Yazoo Pass. When the Federals were first trying their route into capturing Vicksburg and they blew the dam at Moon Lake, Loring commanded there at Greenwood.
Well, Loring was in command, but he didn't select a position.
True.
That was Pendleton, who was a great engineer.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, have you seen the movie Glory, Glory? About the slaughter of that black regiment?
Yeah.
Pendleton selected that position too, and even General Beauregard complimented him. He said, whoever picked this position had no mean military ability. He was praising Pendleton. Pendleton couldn't get his orders obeyed at Champion Hill, and when Cockrell and his boys launched that great attack, which some of the Yankees said was the best they ever saw, they couldn't reinforce his victory because he had ordered Loring to support it, and Loring wouldn't move. And then Loring escaped, losing all his artillery and all his wagons. And he didn't send a dispatch runner to Pendleton to tell him where he was. So Pendleton tried to hold at Big
Black. Yeah.
That battle would not have been fought, except he was trying to keep escape routes open for Loring, who was headed to Crystal Springs in the other direction.
Well, if Joe Johnston wouldn't have been trying to talk Pemberton into meeting up at Jackson, Big Black never would have happened, or Champion Hill never would have happened.
That's true too. Champion Hill wouldn't have happened. That was a meeting engagement caused by Johnston's orders. And Pendleton later said he'd have fought the Vicksburg campaign in exactly the same way, except he would not have obeyed Joe Johnston. And he wrote a report about it, kind of the irony of history. And he submitted it for the inclusion in the official records. Well, General Wright, who was a Southern representative for that, decided it was too long. It was 150 legal pages handwritten, and he did not include it. And they disappeared and showed up at a flea market in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1999. And a fellow named Smith published it as a book. But Johnston may have been slow on the battlefield, but he was very quick to justify himself in print after the war.
The other thing I don't like about Joe Johnston, just to harp on him while we're harping on him, is how Johnston dies. Being a pallbearer at Sherman's funeral and refusing to wear a hat and then catching pneumonia. To me, just their relationship is just a little bit too much for me.
That sounded like a myth to me, and some historians have declared that it was untrue. But the dates don't match. If he'd gotten sick right after that, he would probably have died within a month. And he lived several months after the funeral, as I recall. But I'd have to check that. But like I say, the historians nowadays don't seem to think that was true. It's one of those romantic myths. There are a lot of them. That's the thing you got to watch out for as a historian. You got to separate the myths from the reality.
So many times myths do get thrown in, and of course that's just everything I always heard, growing up. And I think part of the myth, Ken Burns mentions it in his documentaries about it's only worth watching the Shelby Foote portions. So besides Champions Hill, what else against Old Blizzards that ranks him as a bad?
Well, Loring wouldn't cooperate with Robert E. Lee or anybody else in West Virginia in 1861. He wouldn't cooperate with General Floyd or Henry Wise or Robert E. Lee or anybody but himself. Matter of fact, later, he had to work with Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was going to court-martial him. President Davis wouldn't allow it, and that's when they sent him to Mississippi. And I think that was one of the great mistakes Pendleton made there. He he accepted him, and he shouldn't have. Robert E. Lee once said, "There is no place in my army for W.W. Loring." So Pemberton did accept him, and the result was a disaster at Champion Hill, for which, frankly, I hold Loring more responsible for than anybody else except Joe Johnston.
And then number 10, you have John Porter McCowan.
Who?
John Porter McCowan.
Oh, yeah, my God. Yes. He was a great ornithologist, bird watcher. He even had a bird named, 3 species of birds named after him. He's great at that. He was good in the West, but he was promoted to his level of incompetency. He lost New Madrid and Island number 10, and Beauregard said it was the worst defense of a fixed position anybody made in the entire war. And I think Beauregard got that probably right. Even so, they promoted him to division commander. A lot of these people were promoted based on what they did in the regular army. And he again flubbed up at the Battle of Stone River. Now, part of that was he was calling for the removal of Braxton Bragg as Army commander, so he definitely had to go from Bragg's point of view. But Bragg made a wheel maneuver, and Gowan was on the outside, and he did not do well. He delayed and was a contributing factor to the defeat. And Braxton Bragg wanted him court-martialed. They reduced that to a court of inquiry, but they did find that he performed poorly. In fact, during the Kentucky campaign, Bragg left him at Chattanooga. He says, "Our worst general, let's leave him there so he can't mess up too badly." But he did mess up at Stone River. And the Court of Inquiry suspended him from command for 6 months, which ruined his career.
Yeah.
He resigned, went to Arkansas, became a farmer, and a highly respected member of the community around Magnolia, Arkansas. He was a good man promoted beyond his level of competency.
Yeah, I think it's like the Peter effect is what most modern people call it. And I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I know one of his grandsons. And not great grandson, but regular grandson. Not 100% on it. But I'm pretty sure. I know that the guy is a real grandson. I know that his ancestor was a general, and they share the same last name. So that all being said, though, then your dishonorable mentions. You have Gideon Pillow, which I completely agree with. Earl Gideon Pillow.
No, it was Van Dorn.
Yeah. Then you have Earl Van Dorn, which I can see with Second Corinth and Baton Rouge, as well as his womanizing. He did pretty good during Holly Springs, though.
Yeah.
John Bell Hood, specifically 1864 to 65. And I definitely agree with the 64 part. And what happened with Franklin, and as well as kind of like we talked about with the Atlanta campaign. I think he was just over his head. Louis Wigfall, William Henry Carroll, John S. Roan, John Roberts Jones, and then Joe Wheeler. What? Why Joe Wheeler?
Why who?
Why Joe Wheeler?
Wheeler. Well, Wheeler had some positive traits. He was a good man. He was devoted to the cause. He was absolutely fearless. But he was 26 years old, trying to command a corps. He lost the men. He couldn't enforce discipline. In the Atlanta campaign, for example, practically everybody wanted him replaced because his troops got out of hand. He couldn't keep them in hand. And frankly, that's why Wade Hampton was promoted to lieutenant general because Wheeler was a senior cavalry officer. He was senior to Major General Wade Hampton. So let's promote Hampton to lieutenant general so he can take charge of Wheeler and the cavalry. And it did perform much better under Hampton, although it was too late to save the war, obviously.
Yeah.
His raids were often, some of them worked, many of them didn't. But he never could discipline the troops. Nathan Bedford Forrest talked about how he had a unit report to him that Forrest had previously commanded. It was 2,000 men when he gave it to Wheeler. Most of them had deserted. It was about 60 of them left. And Forrest said, I believe they will flock to me when I take command. And they did. Forrest had an electric effect on the troops, and Wheeler didn't. Wheeler himself admitted that he had failed, that he was incompetent at that level, and that he should be replaced by somebody like Forrest. Of course, that's when the Army split. Hood went toward Nashville, an ultimate disaster. He took Forrest with him. And Wheeler was left to fight Sherman in the March to the Sea, of which he never had a chance. But some of the civilians said that Wheeler's men were almost as bad as Sherman's. They were out of hand. I knew that was a controversial selection when I made it, but I'm sorry, I think Wheeler was promoted beyond his level of competence. Yeah. He was a good infantry regiment commander, though.
Yeah. Well, I've got to agree with the list for at least the worst, with the exception of maybe throwing Joe Johnston on there. Now, looking at your list of best names, there are some that I would replace. I would definitely keep the top three. I would keep Claiborne on there as well. But on mine, I would have added Francis Marion Cockrell, who you've already mentioned. Cockrell's Missouri Brigade, and Cockrell himself did, as far as on the brigade level, was a very, very good, effective commander. Is just stuck in the Western Theater. Another one that I texted you about Friday, but definitely wanted on my list because I'm starting to read more about him. He's got a pretty good little biography on what I've been able to see so far. Is William Mahone. Mahone was, his beginning of the war, not even in the military yet, but captures the naval yards and stuff like that around Hampton Roads. Is very interesting, as well as his command in the ANV. Another one that I would have thrown on there is Dorsey Pender.
You could make a case for either one of those, yes.
Dorsey Pender. What I love the most about Pender, and what got me started on that, I was wearing my I got a T-shirt from the North Carolina division that talks about Pender, but I'm trying to pull it up. All right. It's after his death at Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee wrote and said that the loss of Major General Pender is severely felt by the Army and the country. He served with this Army from the beginning of the war, took a distinguished part in all engagements, wounded on several occasions. He never left his command in action until he received the injury that resulted in his death. His promise and usefulness as an officer were only equaled by the purity and excellence of his private life. And one thing I will say, if you look at the light division, the light division actually did they had nothing but good commanders when they were in that division. AP Hill, I like AP Hill, but he's one of those again that I would put him as mediocre. Because of the illnesses that he suffered throughout the war. Don't come at me, chat, but he would get so high strung. I think that, is what caused his illness for the most part.
Well, it could have been the syphilis that he contracted at West Point.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to bring it up, but okay. But the old soldier's disease. But Hill, like I said, is one of those that's I do. The one good thing I will say about Hill is one of the good things is both on Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee's deathbed, they both called for AP Hill. So that's got to be something.
Yeah.
But still the light division ended up having good commanders is my whole point of that. And Pender, takes over the light division after AP Hill gets promoted.
Well, in my opinion, when they promoted AP Hill to Corps Commander, the Confederacy traded a good division commander for a mediocre Corps Commander.
Yeah. Also on my list is Jeb Stuart. Now I know I say, and I wrote a thesis on it in college, that during the Gettysburg campaign, the reason why he got caught off guard is the whole purpose of this was he had a mental breakdown, a slight mental breakdown, but he had a mental breakdown. The stresses of his daughter Flora dying that spring, Stonewall Jackson dying, being shifted from cavalry command to infantry command, back to cavalry command, the unintentional snub that he received from Robert E. Lee, who he looked at as a father figure almost, when he missed the Grand Review, Pelham's death, a lot of that. So vocational stress, family stress, and then extended family or work family stress really got to him, and that's what caused him to be a little bit off guard. And that and a little bit of superiority, because by that point in the war, Confederate cavalry was out whipping Federal cavalry left and right. And he was trying to recapture some of that. How do I put it? His ride around the Army of the Potomac, instead of being the eyes and ears for the Army of Northern Virginia, was trying to reinstill confidence in himself. Last week's episode, Jason, you should have tuned in. Sorry. But still, overall, I still think he was a very adequate and good cavalry commander for most of the war.
Yeah.
And then number 5 that I would have added is one that's relatively unknown, but we mentioned him last week, is William Ward Adams. Adams, with what he had to deal with during the Vicksburg campaign, as well as the Meridian campaign, he still put up a heck of a fight. And he was my dad's favorite, and I've heard more stories about Ward Adams than I've heard about anything else. So that's I would definitely put him as a very, very good, capable officer.
Well, that was a great thing about the Confederate Army. There's no shortage of people you could rank in the top 10. There was no shortage of good commanders overall. I had a harder time with the best than the worst because there were fewer worst and a lot of better.
Yeah,
but,
and that is the great thing about our heritage is the fact that we're going through these lists of the bad ones, and besides Braxton Bragg and Loring, I never heard of the other ones.
okay.
So that's well, I mean the actual number. Now, of course, I've heard of Gideon Pillow and Earl Van Dorn.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of John Floyd too.
No, I'd never heard of Floyd until you brought him up.
Really?
Really?
He was the man who decided to surrender Fort Donelson. He was a Confederate commander at Fort Donelson.
Yeah. Well, and Pillow. And the only thing I remembered about Fort Donelson is that Forrest was able to escape through the freezing cold, and the exchange of I relinquish command, I refuse command, I accept command. That boom, boom, boom. I remember that being a historical tidbit because correct me if I'm wrong, Floyd was the former Federal that was wanted on treason or something like that, or potentially wanted on treason for shipping guns or something south. We talked about it last week, but that's all I remembered about him, about Donelson.
Donelson was unnecessary. You've got to blame Albert Sidney Johnston for that, and also John Floyd. He could have escaped, but he listened to Simon Buckner, and Buckner thought Grant had 50,000 men. He had 27,000. 7,000 of them were still on boats, so he could have escaped with a little over 12,000 men. Now, what would have happened at Shiloh 2 months later if Johnston had had an extra 12,000 men? We came pretty close to overrunning Grant's army as it was. 12,000 would have made the difference. And Floyd was under indictment. And I've looked into it since I wrote Bustell Wide Open. Most historians say he was innocent. He wasn't, I don't think. He shipped over 100 heavy guns to the South when he was Secretary of War. And he was going to ship over 100 more 32-pounders. But President Buchanan stopped him. So there was some prima facie evidence against him. I'm not sure they could have gotten a conviction. But Floyd didn't want to find out. So he would not surrender personally. Well, that smacks of cowardice, frankly. Yeah. And then he took off for Nashville, and he left almost immediately, didn't evacuate anything, and ordered the second in command, Nathan Bedford Forrest, to follow suit. Well, Forrest didn't see any reason to follow that order, so he emptied the city insofar as he was capable. He sent rifle works, rifles, 250,000 pounds of bacon, wagons, everything he could, until the Union soldiers appeared across the river and the mayor of Nashville asked him to leave.
Yeah.
I've often wondered what would happen if the mayor hadn't asked him to leave. Might have
So
battle in the streets of Nashville.
Yeah. So looking at some of the comments, Jason Lloyd said that D.H. Hill would be on his list of honorable mentions. I almost had D.H. Hill on mine, but Hill, like so many other generals there at the end of the war, didn't have a command. From, and he still got into it with Robert E. Lee there after Jackson's death, and I wonder how much of Jackson being his brother-in-law played into the fact that he wasn't shipped west sooner.
Well, Hill could be a good commander. He did not do well at Chickamauga. They had promoted him to lieutenant general acting rank, and Davis revoked that after Chickamauga because he was supporting Braxton Bragg, who wanted Hill to be fired, and they gave him a minor command in North Carolina. He wrote a dispatch. I wish I had it in front of me. I'd read it to you. It's the only dispatch in the whole Civil War I consider literature. Hill was later president of University of Arkansas and Davidson College in North Carolina. He was a Christian. He was a good man, but he was peculiar as a $3 bill. And he didn't seem to be able to get along with his superiors. He very brave man. If I had to list the bravest Confederate general, I'd pick D.H. Hill.
Yeah.
I mean, Stephen Dill Lee was very brave. I remember reading, if you got time for an anecdote, in the advance on Nashville. There was a artillery battery commander named Walton, who was extremely good at what he did. So D.H. Hill, General Chalmers, and Nathan Bedford Forrest went to watch him shell a Union position. Well, problem was, on the other side of the hill, there was a whole battalion of Union artillery, about 60 guns. So they kind of got mad at him for shooting up their positions. And they opened up and dismounted one of Walton's guns. They blew up a caisson, ammunition chest. And everybody hit the dirt. And General Chalmers wrote about this, except Stephen Dill Lee. And he looked up and he saw Stephen Dill Lee, and he felt really ashamed of himself. But then a lieutenant rode up, and Nathan Bedford Forrest was on the ground also. Yeah, get out of here, get out of here. And he said, then I felt better. But D.H. Hill would go further than that. If he thought a man was ducking too much, he'd ride up on his horse and call a man up under enemy fire, make him stand at attention, give me your rifle. And Hill would sit on top of the horse and shoot at a Yankee. And then they would discuss, did I hit him? Did I kill him? Do you think he'll survive? Did I miss? How did I miss? Was I high, low, what side? How could I have corrected this? How could I have done better? All the while under enemy fire, totally fearless. And I think that's something to say for D.H. Hill.
Yeah.
But he was a pain in the buttocks if you were his commanding officer, and I think that ruined him.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, and which again is kind of weird that D.H. Hill, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but did he end up commanding the light brigade at some point, or light division?
No, I don't think he did. He did command the division, but it wasn't.
Yeah, I didn't think so. But with him being so cantankerous, and yet under Jackson's command, who Jackson tried court-martialing. You mentioned one earlier, but also Loring, but also Garnett, and who didn't put up with that sort of thing. Was still. I would be interested to see how that dynamic. Just as like a fly on a tent, so to speak. Michael C. Hardy wrote in that John W. Fraser was the most hated Confederate general during the war. What's your take on that?
Well, you certainly make a case for it. I didn't put him on my top 10 worst, but maybe I should have. He he got bluffed into surrender by Ambrose Burnside. It was very persuasive, but the odds were about even, and we surrendered without firing a shot. And he went to prison, and the Confederate War Department made absolutely no effort to exchange for him. So his only battle, he did very badly. I tended to put on people who lost campaigns and showed up badly more than once, but you could sure make a case for Fraser. I will not dispute what our colleague wrote.
And then Jason Lloyd again wanted to know, where would you have placed John C. Breckinridge? Would you put him as an honorable mention, or where would you have placed Breckinridge?
Depends on the time of the war. He was one of those people that grew. Remind me a little bit of George Washington, but Washington was pretty mediocre to start with. I think Breckinridge didn't do as well as Shiloh as he might have, but he progressed as the war progressed and became a fine commander.
Yeah. I think if his defense there at the siege of Jackson, July of '63, he did pretty well there. And then at that point, it was on the up and up. Of course, what he did in the Valley there in '64 against, what was that German? Stiegel.
Stiegel.
Yeah.
Was Hungarian.
Yeah. Was he Hungarian?
Yeah. In fact,
thought he was a Kraut.
No, Hungarian, but not that much difference. In the Valley, he had his orders translated into 3 languages, or 2, English and German, and his native Hungarian. A lot of mercenaries were involved in that. And of course, as you know, Breckinridge took him to the woodshed with the help of the VMI cadets and some other, Wharton and some other generals.
Yeah. And final comment we'll bring up. So we'd already mentioned Jubal Early as an honorable mention, but Jason also said he would have added Robert Rhodes as an honorable mention.
Well, I'm not going to argue that either. You could certainly make a case for it. I stopped adding honorable and dishonorable mentions when I ran out of the page.
Yeah.
But I didn't think it was appropriate to add 25 more, but you certainly could. Like I say, we didn't have a shortage of good generals. We had some poor ones. And, you could argue Van Dorn. He did a great job. Van Dorn was promoted above his level of competency. He didn't need to be in charge of an army. He did well in the cavalry. And there's a myth about Van Dorn that he was Dr. Peters shot him because he was fooling around with his wife. Well, it's not true. He shot him because he was fooling around with his 14-year-old daughter, who he impregnated, and she gave birth to his 4th illegitimate child. But that was after Daddy shot him.
Right.
The moral here is 40-odd-year-old men should not have adulterous affairs with 14-year-old girls, especially if they have a daddy who knows how to shoot.
Yeah. No kidding. I was in a movie. Well, it wasn't really a movie. It was a campaign to get a movie funded about Van Dorn a couple years ago, and a good friend of mine wrote a book. With some research on that. She lives in Raymond, where my sister lives, and her son graduated with my nephew.
You're talking about Professor Bridget Smith.
Yes.
That's a piece of forensic history I ever saw.
Yeah. Bridget's something else.
She's a great speaker. We had her at our camp at West Monroe one day. She brought the house down.
She is, and not too bad to look at either.
I noticed that.
Yeah. One name that escaped both of our lists that kind of surprised me is Kirby Smith, and there's a name I also haven't seen in the chat.
Well, if you put him anywhere, you'd have to put him in the dishonorable mention category. He was a good man, but he fought at First Manassas. He lasted 5 minutes before he got shot, and it worked out for him because his nurse, an attractive woman who married him, and they had 11 children. But he didn't, and he was great in the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky. He swamped those guys about equal. He destroyed about 80% of the Union Army, and the rest of them were fit to join a track team. They left so fast. But after that, he didn't cooperate with Bragg. I think he
can we fault him with that?
And they kicked him upstairs to command the Trans-Mississippi, where he did a poor job. He could have cut, Grant went down the bank, the Mississippi south of Vicksburg on the Louisiana side in Kirby Smith's department. And his supplying his whole army on one road, that when flooded conditions, Kirby Smith, if he cut that road, Grant had nowhere to go. They'd had to break out the white flags, but Kirby Smith was more interested in protecting Shreveport, and that was a disaster. And in the Red River campaign, he didn't properly support Richard Taylor. Taylor asked for floating bridge companies. He wouldn't give it to him. They sat there in Shreveport unused. And Taylor was unable to cross Bayou Pierre and cut off the Union fleet. And he could have. Imagine what would have happened if they lost the entire Western flotilla. They lost a good part of it anyway. But I'd put him in the negative category, maybe not the top 10, worst top 10, but certainly poor.
And then last one, we're going to wrap it up. Bishop Polk and B.F. Cheatham.
Mixed bag. I think Polk's worst mistake was crossing the border, taking Columbus, Kentucky, breaking Kentucky's neutrality. Although you could say, well, that is impossible anyway. And you're right. Anybody that looks at a map knows that Kentucky neutrality was going to fall at some point or another. But the timing was wrong. He did it right after Fremont issued the first Emancipation Proclamation. He did it, I think it was on August 30th. Abraham Lincoln repudiated it, and he made him revoke it on like September 2nd. But that sent shockwaves through Kentucky and Missouri, because a lot of the Union sympathizers were slave owners. And who knows what would have happened if he hadn't done that. Like I say, that was a big mistake. He didn't really distinguish himself. His men loved him, though. I think he was a better man than he was a general, but I wouldn't put him in the worst category. Cheatham, positive except for Stone River, where he was said to be drunk. He apparently was. Bragg later pulled that card to try to court-martial him. He didn't do it at the time, but only when Cheatham decided that Bragg needed to be replaced did Bragg decide Cheatham needed to be replaced. But he wasn't. Bragg did replace Polk. He did fire him, but it was by the time he decided to get rid of Cheatham, it didn't work. Cheatham, little piece of gossip here. When they were invading Tennessee, Mrs. Peters, the one who had the affair with Earl Van Dorn, Dr. Peters' wife, invited Bedford Forrest to headquarter at her mansion. She and her husband had separated, at least geographically. Mrs. Peters, of course, was an nymphomaniac. And Forrest wouldn't even talk to her without another man present. He didn't want to give the appearance of impropriety. Cheatham headquartered there one night. And draw your own conclusions. Now, Justice Cheatham, he was not married at that time. But she was.
Well, Forrest had a hard enough time getting Mary Ann to agree to marry him. I don't think he married above. And I mean, just how, of course, she ends up, helping him, turn around after the war. But the daughter of a minister, I couldn't see Forrest doing anything to try to mess that up.
Forrest was a one-woman man. He fired one of his best friends because he had sex outside of marriage. He said he would not have in my army anybody who would do that to a woman.
Yeah. Now Cheatham gets a lot of crap for the mismanagement, and I'm using what modern historians say, Spring Hill. But I don't blame him for Spring Hill. I blame John Bell Hood for not issuing clear, definitive answers or orders before going to bed.
I agree with you. I felt more than anybody else Hood was responsible for that. But you got to blame Jefferson Davis to some degree because he put a physically handicapped man in charge of an army, and Hood could not keep up. You had an energetic officer like Richard Taylor who could ride a horse. It would have turned out much differently.
Yeah, well, that is a big requirement instead of being tied into the saddle. But anyway, Dr. Cheatham, we appreciate you coming on for 2 weeks. It is 8:13, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Y'all go check out last week's episode and rewatch this one if you're just now tuned in or if you tuned in late. Very, very interesting topic, and of course, these are all subjective to our own personal beliefs. But hey, that's what we want to do is encourage you to think and research and draw your own information from history. Definitely pick up Dr. Sandy Mitcham's book. Give me the official name of your encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia of Confederate Generals. I also got a book, Voices from the Confederacy, which covers a lot of this.
So get y'all a copy of it. Do some reading. Moose, what do we have planned for this week?
Wednesday we have the rerun in honor of Rock, who passed away. Then, of course, on Tuesday we have Look Around Florida, and on Thursday we have Look Around the Confederation. So make sure you send in your news to scvyouthOutreach@gmail.com, and you'll be featured on the upcoming episode of Look Around the Confederation. Now, when we get on Thursday, I will want to announce the schedule for Army commanders again. Now that we're out of reunion, I wanted to give them time to get into their new roles. I think everybody was a new Army commander this go around. So we wanted to give them some time to get settled in their position, but I'll be reaching out to them this weekend, getting an official. But with that being said, we'll just be going over the news, talking about events, anything that tops into Confederate, SCV, or Heritage news, send it our way. And I think that's about it. We do have a great announcement. We have reached over 1,000 subscribers now, and we've broken 6,000 on Facebook. So,
Okay.
Well, and
Go ahead.
there's one more thing we've got to announce, Harrison.
what?
We have new merch.
No, we don't. No, we
Yes,
don't
we
have
do.
new merch.
Yes,
Stop
we
with
have
the
new merch.
Do you have the pictures?
So we have the official Moose Hunt 2025 t-shirts available on our Bonfire store. $40. $40. Buy a shirt, you get 4 free shots at moose during next year's moose hunt. So $40. We have it in a t-shirt, we have it in a hoodie, we have it in another t-shirt that just comes in black and charcoal. These come in the Army colors as well as military green. And we have it in a crew neck sweatshirt and comfort colors. So
Thanks.
go to scvchat.com, support us, go our bonfire, get you a Moose Hunt t-shirt, 4 free shots at Moose next year.
Sadly, the
Reunion.
Moose Hunt aren't on the website yet, but you can just click on the store icon and it will send you over to the store and you can get them. Because I thought this was a joke because it started off doing beep, boop, beep because of my word fumble Thursday. And I was like, okay, I look away and Connor's got a picture of me with crosses.